Well, we're live, and I'm going to check over to the. Oh, wow, it's working. This is exciting. Okay, IG
Great.
Live seems to be working. I guess with
Yay.
that, I'll give us an introduction. So I'm Vivi Henriette of Art of the Zodiac, and I'm here to talk with Reverend and astrologer Lindsey. Lovely
Aw,
to meet you.
you too. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh my God, you're so welcome. We've been trying to set this up for a bit.
So long since the
Chaotic
fall,
life.
right?
What?
Since last fall.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then the Venus retrograde happened. Or no, that Venus retrograde happened, then the eclipses happened. And it was just like nothing really came together until the last month, I have to say.
And I'm so excited. I was started like binging on your website blog,
Mm.
and I'm already thinking, I'm like, okay, so we're gonna have this talk. I'm so excited to dive in, and then I'm like, okay, we have to do another podcast recording. Like, I'm just like obsessed with you. So that's my big intro here.
Oh, thank you. That's so sweet. What did you see that piques your interest? I'm so curious.
Well, I mean, like your whole. We'll just dive in, right? Like, just fascinated by your whole story. So you went to ministry school. Am I saying this right?
Mhm.
Is it
Seminary, yeah.
seminary? And yeah, like, and you left the church. Like, what? Let's start here. What drew you to the church before we get to the point of how you like got pushed out? Let's can we start from the
Yeah,
very beginning?
from the very beginning. It's the very best place to start. So, I mean, it's my faith story is really interesting, and I think in some ways my astrology story is older than my faith
Yeah.
story because I did not grow up in the church, and
Oh, okay.
I went to seminary when I was in my 20s, and it was after, I didn't know anything about astrology at the time, but year 23, right, when the sign in your
Mhm.
12th house is activated, and I was just a wreck, and I was living in DC. I was actually working for the government, and I was on the Obama campaign in
Wow.
2008, and then went and worked in the government as a political appointee. And I was so depressed, Vivi. I like could not handle it. I felt, I was like wearing like pink suits and stuff, like Elle Woods. In the government, and like it was like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. Like it just did not work for me. And I just had like no sense of meaning in my life, and I had developed a really severe anxiety problem. And I think a lot of us have this experience in the like early mid 20s, right? This kind of quarter life crisis.
Yeah.
And um ended up doing 12-step program actually, to address, like, I did Codependence Anonymous, which
Yeah.
actually really saved my life. And helped me start to kind of uncover some like really deep familial patterns that I, had survived, that I wasn't even really conscious of. And um, part of 12 step is like learning about a higher power, acknowledging a
Mhm.
higher power. And it just unlocked something spiritually for me where I was like, I don't know what it is that I need to find, but I know that I'm
Yeah.
seeking. And I started going to a Unitarian Universalist church in DC, which
Okay.
is like a really open kind of denomination, like they call themselves non-creedal. So they don't have a
Okay.
set list of beliefs that you have to believe in order to go there. And I talked to a minister at some point about, like wanting to maybe pursue ministry because I saw what they were doing and I really loved it, right? They were making
Yeah.
meaning for people. They were creating community. They were writing. They were in music, singing. And I mean, it was just like, I was like, oh, this is it.
Yeah.
And the minister that I spoke to asked me a bit about myself and said, I think you should go to Union Theological Seminary,
Okay.
which is a seminary that's really rich in liberationist history.
Mhm.
So, like, liberation theology is a type of theology that focuses on like the freedom and liberation of people through like loving each other and through
Yeah.
like embodying God's love. And so it's a really progressive kind of leftist seminary that has this history of demonstration and like really amazing theology around race and gender. And so I just like learned a ton there. And at that point, it was, I sort of was on this backwards journey of faith where I was like, oh, I really like this Jesus story, right? Because
Yeah.
I learned about it in a way that many people don't growing up, right? I learned about it as an adult as this like grand leveling project, right? Where like the lowly are lifted and the mighty are brought down. And like there's there's this moment where like heaven can happen on earth where we have like equity and mutuality. And
Yeah.
I have Libra rising. So of course this like really spoke to me. I
Yeah.
didn't know that at the time. Um, and I was doing like arts and ritual. That was actually my main focus in seminary. And I had started an arts and ritual organization with a friend and thought we were just going to kind of do that. And
Yeah.
then as life would have it, like I sort of just fell backwards into church ministry. I actually had no desire to do church ministry. And so
Can we pause for a moment real, because I
yeah,
wanna
yeah,
dig
sorry.
deeper
I'm
into
like,
that. No, 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 this is good. I just wanna dig deeper into a couple things.
yeah.
You said that, like, it was the 12-step program around codependence that first got you into this higher power and then going to this Unitarian church. Was there any religion growing up for you? Right? Like, at all?
It's funny you should ask that. Um, so yes and no. My mom was a single parent and she was really not religious. And had some church wounding, and it's so understandable that she turned away from the church. Her mother had been an alcoholic and died when my mom was 19.
Mm,
And a minister told her that because my grandmother was an alcoholic, that she was in hell. And I mean, this is like, it's so sad the like trauma that ministers
yeah,
cause people by saying things like this. And I don't think my mom bought it, but she was also like, this is not for me.
yeah,
Um, and but what's also interesting is that she had a very close friend
mhm,
who was a Catholic priest, and he was in my life, like, from the time I was born until he actually died, a couple years ago,
okay,
and he was like a father figure for me, and
yeah,
he was not allowed to talk about faith with me, like, she didn't permit him to talk about faith with me, but I was around him all the time,
yeah,
um, and so it was a very it was weird, like, I was, like, very much proximal to faith, but
yeah,
also
yeah,
not talking about it or thinking about it. So I had this father figure who was a Catholic priest in my life, who actually and I know, like, there's a lot of stuff with Catholic priests, but he was actually a
yeah,
really wonderful person for me, and probably the most stable and kind adult in my life growing
yeah,
up. Um and so, yeah, and, I've kind of, like, dug into his chart, and we have the same moon placement, which was so touching, like, when I found that out,
yeah,
and, yeah, I think that there was something about being close to him that influenced me in some ways to ministry, but wasn't really conscious about it until later on, you know?
yeah. What may I ask, so he couldn't talk to you about faith directly, but what
Mhm.
was your experience about how he lived his life, right? Like, were there glimpses that came through, or did you like, what did you imagine his life was like what he did for for work or any of that?
I mean, honestly, I thought it was kind of weird and spooky because, he's a Catholic priest and he was it, he moved from parish to parish every like 7 years or so.
Okay.
and he always stayed pretty local to us.
Yeah.
And but there was this one place where he was at where he was in charge of a rectory, which is just like a community of
Yeah.
priests who were all retired. They had all aged out. But the church takes care of them until they die. And so he was like took care of all these old guys. And that
Yeah.
was sort of the most contact that I got with his like lifestyle or whatnot. And it was
Yeah.
really like it was he lived in this like creepy old building with like crucifixes everywhere. And I was like, this is I don't like it. It really creeped me out aesthetically. Like I was like, this is
Yeah.
not for me. Um, but I think it was more of his influence of just like how kind he was
Yeah.
and just like compassionate and so funny, such a like the best storyteller.
Yeah.
Um, and so yeah, I think that influence kind of crept in and just the way that he loved and loved me, like I think it helped keep me open to loving people in the ways that like ministers are called to love people.
Oh,
But
wow, that's really
theologically, I don't think there was much there that spoke to me.
yeah,
Like
but
the
it
glimpses that I
that's
got, I was
yeah,
like,
wow,
this is kind of weird.
and so, I mean, okay, so let's now we can fast forward back and you're in seminary
Mhm.
and, arts and ritual, am I getting this right?
Mhm.
What, like, what does that look like? And also, I guess maybe to wrap this other question up, once you were in seminary, were you able to, like, look back at him and, like, was there sort of a review of, like, what was going on as a child through a new lens?
Mm. I mean, like, what was going on with the dynamics between him and my mother or between just, like,
Any of
religiously?
it, the whole situation.
Yeah, I mean, my my first nodal return was, like, very eye-opening, and it was
Mhm.
also the same time, that Pluto entered Capricorn into my house of home and family, and so it was
Okay,
pretty Mm, a lot, like, came to the surface during my nodal return about the relationship, between my mother and this priest, right?
okay.
Um, and and then, so uh, there's a lot of stuff to work out familially there. And when I was in seminary, I mean, it was interesting because I think for a Catholic priest, he was not particularly conservative, but he was more conservative than I was. And I think that I started to have some theological conversations with him while I was in seminary and was really
Mm,
like, oh, like we have some differences about how we view God, how we view, you know, issues like abortion or LGBTQ rights, things like that. Um, and I think I also developed an appreciation and an understanding in some ways for all of the training that he had. I mean, he went to boarding school when he was, like, 12.
wow.
Um, that you go like, Catholic priests, at least I don't know what it's like anymore, but
Yeah,
in the '60s or whenever it was that he went, or '50s maybe. Yeah, it was the '50s. Yeah, you left home at a very young age, and it was you were often kinda just sent, right? Like, there was a familial lineage for him. Um and I think maybe that there is some element of feeling like I am carry on his legacy in that way,
yeah,
even though we're not related by blood, but he was very much like a father to me. That looking back, I could feel that connection of like, I'm gonna carry the mantle.
wow, and which is beautiful. You get the choice, so you got to choose to do that, and so thinking about, I was sort of segueing here, what is art and ritual, or what did that look like? You said you were doing
Mhm.
art and ritual, yeah.
In seminary, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
There were different focuses that you could choose in
okay,
seminary and you would sort of get like like a certificate upon graduation that you
yeah,
focused on this particular thing. And um, I had always been a singer. That was something
Mhm.
that I had, throughout my childhood had sung and was very into art and, visual art. And I love,
Yeah.
like, when I was little, if you'd be like, "Lindsay, what do you like doing?" I'd say singing and making stuff. I just like wanted to make stuff and sing.
Yeah.
And and so in seminary, the context for art and ritual is typically around like worship and worship
Mhm.
design. What was really exciting about the seminary that I went to, Union, is that they have a chapel program that's very experimental. So instead of having a set like liturgy or ritual every day,
Yeah.
which a lot of seminary chapels do, each singular chapel service was unique and was planned by students and designed by students. And so what happened at the chapel and the seminary was that we would get like fire breathers and people who would do silks in this like extraordinarily tall neo-Gothic chapel, right? Like climbing silks and aerialists. We had like a drag chapel every year where the message was about drag and the
Yeah.
theology of drag, and then we would all get into drag in chapel together. So there is this very open, experimental, artistic avenue for worshipful expression in seminary. And so I worked in that chapel for a couple of
Yeah.
years, my second and third year of seminary, and also took classes where the focus was on worship and the arts.
It kind
Um,
of, sorry
yeah,
to it sounds like set design for church,
yeah,
right?
totally.
Going back to your Elle Woods days, and you're like, "Oh, I wore these big," feels like like having this sort of like penchant for like, I want to say like fashion, right? Like these pink suits.
Yeah,
Do you feel like that part of you got to come out? Like you got to sort of, yeah, like
totally.
set an event planning for church.
Totally. And I think that this is hard for some people to
Yeah.
come to grips with, but there's really not that big of a difference between theater and worship. I mean, they have all the same elements. The ritual purpose might be
Yeah.
slightly different between theater and worship, but the building blocks of both are the same.
It makes me think of how right, like the Golden Dawn and Pamela Coleman Smith, like that all came from theater, right?
Yeah,
And thinking about even like high magic, like there's that theatrical component too. And then like,
mhm.
right, it just feels like it's all sort of the same stuff.
Totally. I mean, there's costumes,
Yeah.
there's lights, there's music. I mean, there's action, right? There are things that are planned, there are things that are improvised. There's an audience, right? There are people who
Yeah.
are experiencing the ritual moment or the theatrical moment. So they totally, I mean, intersect, if not like, if they're not really kind of the same thing in a way.
Has it done like has the thought like has the word magic at this point come into your sight, like and come into the mind? And was it then? Was there part of you like, oh, I'm making magic? And within the church context, like
Mhm.
what kind of would that word hold? Has that word changed maybe for you from then until now?
Yeah. I don't know that it's changed much. I mean, I think I've always been attuned to magic.
Yeah.
Like, when I was a kid, I learned it was so funny, I was explaining this to a Gen Zer just yesterday that, like, when we were kids in the '90s, we learned how to do magic tricks because that was, like, what there was to do, like, with your like like there were stores and you would go and you would buy magic tricks and do that, and that was something that I was very interested in. And so I from a young age was sort of like, yeah, magic is really cool and I love it, and I loved the like putting on shows for my
Yeah.
friends and my family and that sort of thing. And I remember the very first chapel service at the seminary that I led, I talked about magic, and I had flash paper. Do you know what flash paper is?
Mm-mm. Tell me.
It's paper, and if you light it, it goes like it just disintegrates in like a ball of flame. It's
Yeah.
really fun. And and I remember I think I was like welcoming the class that was coming in, and
Yeah.
I did something like where I was just like magic, and I like and I don't remember what I said, but I remember talking about magic and how like that ritual worshipful space is magic, and magic happens
Right.
there, and it's like a place where we cultivate magic together.
So at this point in your life, things sound pretty rad, right?
It
Like
was
you
pretty
have
rad.
artistic freedom, you feel like engaged, it feels like you have a supportive, open community that feels a bit radical maybe compared to the rest of what you think of church. So there you are.
Yeah.
And how did you and you said you just sort of you weren't looking to become a pastor, right? You weren't looking to
Yeah.
have your own church, but like how did that happen? What's the pivot here?
Just sort of like the way you end up with a job, like, someone who knows someone and they need someone and you have all the skills,
Yeah.
and you need a job. Like that was sort of I was out of seminary, I'd graduated, I was living in Brooklyn. I was so broke. I was living like I was walking dogs. I
Mhm.
was like, it was like that Brooklyn life. Like I just
Yeah.
did not know what to do. I mean, the joke about having a master's of divinity, which is the degree that I got from seminary, is that it's like fairly useless outside of the church, because it's just like people only require that degree in order to become a pastor. Like
Yeah.
that's basically what it's good for. And so, yeah, there was an opportunity to go across the river into New Jersey, um, and there was like a part-time youth pastor
Okay.
position that they needed to fill. And so I did that, and I loved it. I had worked with kids in other contexts, and I just like loved it.
Yeah.
Um, because, I was getting to do all this stuff and I had a budget. I was like taking them bowling and like doing retreats, and it was in a congregation that was like super high pressure, right? Like they were very kind of like upper to upper middle class, like kids in New Jersey. And there's just like a
Yeah.
lot of pressure for them to perform.
Yeah.
And so I just like wanted to create a space where they could just like relax and have fun and be themselves. And a lot of them were so queer, like very, very gay. And so I just like, we just had a good time and I loved it. And then that church needed an associate pastor, which is sort of like a second in command kind of
Yeah.
pastor. And then and I applied for that, and then it's called like they call you, like they vote, the congregation votes, and they kind of
Yeah.
call you to be their minister. And so I did the youth pastor role for like a year, and then I became the associate pastor.
And is this church, was it a Unitarian church? Was it pretty like was your experience here when you moved into the associate and then director position, did you still have at that point the freedoms that you maybe felt back in school? Like with this sort of
Mm,
feels I don't know, it feels like you had this sort of like idyllic experience perhaps. It's like it's
yeah,
idealistic.
it was
How did the reality match up to that when you were here?
Not great. I mean, it was it was a I will say that many, many of the congregants I loved dearly and were
Yeah.
really open, and they hired me because they were really excited about everything that I was doing.
Yeah.
Um, but, it was a United Church of Christ, which is a Christian church, but there's a joke in theological circles
Yeah.
that they refer to the UCC as Unitarians considering Christ. So, very kind of like we would call it like a low theology, right? Like it's just sort of like, yeah, Jesus was like a great minister and person, and like we're all, divine, and
Yeah.
that sort of thing. Um, but there were a lot of people in that church who were very old school and had been attending, for generations, right? Like
Mm.
they were themselves 70 and their grandparents had attended the church. And so there were definitely some streaks of kind of conservatism, not necessarily political
Yeah.
conservatism, but like I don't like class conservatism in a way that
Yeah.
um, made it hard sometimes to like play and have fun. But I got to do that a lot with the kids, which was really great. They were totally into it.
Is this, may I ask where in New Jersey, by the way?
Oh, it was in Montclair.
Oh, okay, yeah, I'm very familiar.
Are
Were you
you?
living yeah, I was, I dated someone in New Jersey for, like, 3 years, so I used to go back and forth, not that far, so I have feelings about New Jersey, all due respect to everyone, great hiking, but
I think most people
I'll
do,
save my thoughts
especially the
there.
people who grew up there.
Huh?
I think most people have feelings about it, especially the people who grew up
Mm,
there.
don't wanna cause any fights. Were you living in Brooklyn, though, and commuting, or were you actually, like, living in Montclair?
For the first year when I was part-time, I was commuting, but then, when I became a full-time minister, they actually had a parsonage, which is like a house that's set aside for the ministers that I lived in, and
Okay.
I lived there with my, at the time, boyfriend, which was very new, right? Like, that had
Yeah.
never happened before, so I was already pushing the boundaries of some of the, like, more conservative folks that I was unwed, living in the church parsonage.
So, I know that your story is eventually you left the church. Is this the church that made you go, "Okay, like, no more?" Or was that a
Yeah.
different or did okay. Tell that story. Let's get to there.
Oh god. It's an awful story. But it is a story that happens to a lot of, I mean, at the time, I identify as non-binary now, but at the
Yeah,
time I was identifying as a woman, queer. I was out queer.
okay.
I my AJ and I, my partner at the time, we did get married, but it was like not a, we weren't like having kids,
Yeah,
that sort of thing. So already I think I was a little uncomfortable for some of the congregants.
yeah,
And what different churches have different models for governance.
okay.
So the UCC has like a bottom up model for governance where the people with the most power are the congregants, and
Okay.
they decide who their ministers are, they decide when the ministers come, and they decide when the ministers go, unless the
Yeah,
minister decides when they go first.
yeah,
um, and the system is very close to kind of the like the democratic system that we live with in the US, where there are terms for leadership, and the leadership turns over after a few years. And so a couple of years in, there was a change in leadership,
mhm,
and I think there were some folks who were pretty like uncomfortable with me and were gunning for some leadership positions so that they could do something about it. And this is a very common story,
yeah,
which is a huge bummer, because it ends up turning away a lot of young clergy, particularly women and queer clergy, from churches, or like destroying their careers, right? Or like really putting
yeah,
speed bumps in their careers. And um, it was one of those things where like nothing was happening, but everything was happening. Like there was no one thing that happened, and there was a lot of stuff like it was just like a kind of psychic mess. I don't know if
yeah,
like one of those situations where you're just like, everyone's mad and fighting and accusing, but there's like actually nothing going on
yeah, yeah.
other than like a series of projections.
Mhm.
And that was the experience. It got pinned on, there was a young adult in the church who was um, in an abusive family environment, and turned 18 and wanted to come stay with us in the parsonage.
Okay.
And we had actually housed someone in a similar position from the church, who was like 19-year-old, just kind of like, I mean, he was like living in the church attic, and we kind of just found him. And I was like, okay, just come live in the parsonage. It's
Yeah,
fine. And leadership at the time was like, great, we love that. Like, that's what
yeah,
Jesus would do. And
yeah,
then the next round of leadership was like, you're a liability, like you're destroying a family, like, that sort of thing. And they just demanded my resignation. and made me sign an NDA, which is like a whole, they make clergy do this a lot. They like paid me my salary out for the rest of the year, but they made me sign an NDA where I wouldn't talk about it, which the National Labor Relations Board has now like nullified those NDAs in the last couple of years, saying like, you can't do that. You can't like
Yeah.
prevent, gag people from like talking about their terrible experience in your organization. So now I'm like, oh, guess I'm talking about it.
Yeah.
And, and so I left. And what's really special is that young person ended up moving to the same town as us, and is now like as close as family. So, like I call them my son. It's really sweet, and it's like a very kind of queer family story. And I think like if for no other reason, I went to that church and had that experience there to meet them and to like become family with them. And so I chalk it up as ultimately a win, even though it was a very nasty experience at the time.
Trying to think of how to like articulate this next question. So bear with me as I sort of work this out, right?
Please.
It feels like when you first went to seminary and you were surrounded by these like-minded thinkers and everyone was open, it feels like, if I'm getting this right, that was a community for you. It was like, oh, like I found my people, like we're creating
Mhm.
these rituals. It feels very open. And then you sort of move forward with the church. And at what point did you come out as queer? And then like was there this pivot where like at some point where you're like, wait, like I actually don't need, it's like maybe a queer person, the church maybe isn't the best place for me. I can actually just go have queer family out of the church, right? Am I getting something here? Like how was that transition?
Totally. I mean, I think, well, to really like look at the meta picture, right?
Yeah.
I grew up like wondering if I was gay or straight because those were the options presented to me. Vivi, can I ask how old you are? I'm just so curious.
Oh, it's okay. I'm 40. So
You're 40.
I'm
Okay. So we're like sort of in the same. I'm
yeah,
37 going on
yeah,
38. So you know what it was like.
yeah,
In, in the 90s and even the early 2000s, I literally did not know that bisexuality was a thing. And any presentation of bisexuality was framed as it was fake, right? Like it wasn't a real thing.
mhm,
And
mhm.
so I think it wasn't even until college when I was sort of like, oh, there's a third option here. And I was like, oh, I'm totally bisexual, right? Like that makes a lot of sense. And I had some of my first like queer experiences. I
Yeah,
mean, that's not true. I had queer experiences before college, but like queer, and I like knew that's what was happening, like
yeah,
I was conscious of it in college. And then, in DC, it was still that my peers there were like not okay with
yeah,
my queerness. And it was not a town that felt very like at the time open to queerness.
yeah,
I might have been running around in the wrong circles too, which is entirely possible. And when I got to seminary, it was like my first time ever meeting like out trans people that were in
mhm,
my seminary. It was my first time being in a group of women who were like loving and practicing like mutuality and being supportive rather than being like competitive.
yeah,
It was really eye-opening for me to be in this setting where I could be queer. I could be, like I would be supported. It was incredible.
yeah,
Um, and I think, yeah, it definitely was like not a comfy thing to talk about in the church. And it's weird. It's weird. It's very hard to be a sexual person at all as a minister.
mhm,
It's very like I don't even have so much access to why it was weird anymore because it's been so long, thank God. But I do just remember feeling like there was no room for my sexuality at all, right? Like, um, and that it would be sort of objectified if I shared or talked about it. Yeah, it's just like very weird dynamic between ministers and congregations, and this sort of line between like assumed intimacy, but then also privacy. And, I remember like I got a membership to the local Y, and
Mm.
I literally got a wetsuit because I like didn't want any of my congregants to see me in a bathing suit because I was just like, ugh, like gave me the ick. So it was a weird thing. And I think when I left the church, right, I like my partner and I at the time like experimented with polyamory. I mean, like it was like a totally different thing. And I wasn't even in that conservative of a denomination. So it still was like kind of oppressive, sexually speaking.
I mean, it's fascinating though, because it's like your first experience with queer community happened in seminary, if I'm hearing this right,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like, it was like you go to
100%.
seminary, you're like, you're making your first trans friends, right? Like, people like, it feels like this very, like, open, sort of utopian place of, and then you go into, like, the ministry, and you're like, "Oh, wait, no, it's actually not like that at all." Like, that the it's I don't know, are you ever like, "Wow, like, this is what" it feels like perhaps maybe the experience of seminary gave you this beautiful gift of, like, what you wanna stand up for and what's important to you. Ironically, couldn't
Mhm.
do that in the church. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a rude awakening. It was a rude awakening. And I'm also grateful because I think there was something about I mean, I think it shaped my faith, right?
Yeah,
In a way that I think the world really needs, and I don't think most people are gonna get to have a faith experience like I had in seminary, right? Where I was being challenged, I was growing, I was, like, being attuned to justice and power dynamics, I was, being kind of, like, opened up to different, gender and sexual orientations and
yeah.
identities, and I think that in some ways that's like the very best expression of faith, right? Is all of those things. And so I am grateful that now I've had that experience and
Yeah.
and I'm building a life for myself where my sort of immediate surroundings are more like that. And also trying to be an influence and a leader in the world to like impart, the possibility of those experiences like via faith to other people.
You know, coming to that, coming to the title bad pastor, right? It feels like you really are like a renegade pastor, right? It feels, I mean, because you're still writing about, I want to say theology, right? Like, tell me a little bit about how bad pastor emerged from all this, right? Did you have a moment where you wanted to leave the church behind altogether? Or like, what
Yeah.
was this origin story?
Well, when I left the church, I was just writing about this for Lent. It's Lent now. It started on Wednesday. And wilderness is like a big theme of Lent. And when I left the church,
Yeah.
I was having this sort of spiritual wilderness experience. And I think I've articulated like those are the clients and the people that I'm most interested in serving are the people who
Yeah.
are having spiritual wilderness experiences, right? Where they're
Yeah.
like, I am not welcome in the civilization, that is the sort of mainstream society. And I'm trying to like figure out this whole like God and spirituality thing beyond that.
Yeah.
Um, and I moved to the desert Southwest, which really was like I don't think I put it together at the time, but it was such a reflection of that spiritual wilderness that I was having. I had to,
Yeah.
like, go to the wilderness to have it
Yeah.
kind of match my experience, and you recently came to Santa Fe, so
I
you
and I missed you. I
I
met
know.
your partner.
That was so funny.
I was, like, so close. But that's another story.
Next time. Um, and I I was waiting tables because like, what else do you do when you kinda like when your career blows up, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that was sort of
I
it, and it was great, I'm glad I did it, because I had been in sort of a, like, white collar professional world for I mean, my entire adult life, basically, and so it was a really positive experience for me to to, like, wait tables and be like, "Oh, that's what this is like," right?
yeah.
And, and I tried to be mysterious about, like, where I had come from, because I just didn't it was so painful and also very weird, right? Like, people are like, "Here's this person who was, like, a minister, like, what are you doing?" But
Were
people,
you
like,
in
had a
Santa Fe,
way
may
of,
I ask?
like
Or outside Santa Fe?
this was in Santa Fe, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And, there was a bartender at the restaurant that I was working at, and I don't know, I think I just, like, cussed or something at some point, and she just said, "Oh, bad pastor," and so she started calling me that, and that's where it came from. But, it's very I'm glad you asked me this, and it does tie back to the priest who raised me because
Yeah.
he would always say to me, "Oh, you're a maverick, Lindsay, you're a maverick," and he just, like, loved this idea of being a maverick, and he was a maverick, and one of the things that I realized or kind of learned about him after he died was that, in the early '90s when he moved, or maybe no, it was probably in the '80s. In the '80s, he moved to Delaware, and there was an old, like, nunnery
Yeah.
in Southern Delaware, and, of course, the AIDS, crisis was
Mhm.
happening, and he just, like, without asking anyone's permission, just opened an AIDS clinic. Um, and I heard from some of his friends that I talked to after he died where they were like, "He did not have the permission to do that," right? Like, he just
Yeah.
did it. He just, like, took the money and did it. And, so I feel like that kind of bad pastor too is, like, part of the mantle that maybe I inherited from him that was sort of like, the church is gonna have its rules, and Jesus has some different rules, and we're just gonna, like, operate under those rules and ask for forgiveness later.
What like, for you, right, you're feels like a little bit of, like, processing this big breakup you just had of the church.
Hmm.
You're in Santa Fe, you're waiting tables, the bartender starts calling you a bad pastor. At what point did you actually, like, own it and being like, "Oh, maybe I'm gonna start teaching, I'm gonna start kind of thinking," or, like, wanting to, like, share, like, your own knowledge and, like, with people? Was that
Yeah.
how did that
I changed my Instagram handle to that, like, pretty shortly after and
okay.
didn't really have a vision for it.
Yeah.
I I had sort of given up on church, but I definitely had not given up on my relationship with the divine and, the ministry the ministry of Jesus that I was like, have been working to emulate. And, but I was learning astrology. That's what I was doing. And, and that was a place where I was able to find some really great queer community, really, supportive, like mutual, kind of mystical, all these
Yeah.
things that I had found in seminary, I was finding in astrologers. And, I it wasn't until a couple years later that I was learning from Chris Brennan and had this aha moment because Hellenistic astrology, right, was developing in the same time and place as the early church.
Mm.
And it was like, and that was really like in 2021 when Bad Pastor, like that was, I was like, yes, this is it, because I wanted to teach Christians who are afraid of astrology, like, that it was okay. And I wanted
Mm.
to work with people who had been harmed by the church, but who were still kind of, like, faithful, in whatever way,
Yeah.
to find meaning and community in astrology like I had. So I think that was the moment when I was like, I get it. I, like, finally get it. It's bad pastor.
I love that. What may I ask who some of the teachers were? Like, who were you learning astrology from in Santa Fe?
Well, no one directly in Santa Fe. I was
Okay.
just, like, getting books. I mean, Channy Nicholas was, like, my gateway
Yeah.
into astrology. I mean, I was still in the church actually when I started learning from her. It was, like, my last year, and, she was doing, like, PowerPoints with voiceovers. I don't know if
I
you
remember those.
Yeah, and so
Yeah.
you'd, like,
Mhm.
order them, and she'd send you a
Yep.
Dropbox link.
Yep.
It's so
Mhm.
amazing to, like, think about. That was just a few years ago. Um, and so I was learning, and then, mostly from her, and then I sorta dabbled, I think I had this, like, I didn't know what I didn't know about astrology,
Yeah.
and so I was, like, getting all these books and kinda reading and, like, talking to people and being online and following folks on Instagram, and then it wasn't really until I don't even know how I think I started listening to the astrology podcast when I was like, "This is way over my head," like, I just
Yeah.
I didn't get it, but it was sort of, like, on my radar, and then a couple of years later after studying, I had, like, enough command of the language that I started listening, and then I was like, "I love Chris Brennan," and I started, like, taking his class and reading his book, and that's when it all clicked.
How what is it about I'm gonna say teachings of the church, or let's say, like, the teachings of Christ, what is it about the Bible, this story, this collection of stories that is meaningful to you and that really, because it feels like there's something from your time in seminary that really resonated, that is still holds meaning, and what is that, and what is it about that you want to share with people?
Hmm. Gosh, that's such a good question. I feel like there's so many answers to that. I think that the call to equity, to social equity. I mean, I'm a social gospel person all the way.
Yeah.
Like this idea that there's really enough for us
Mhm.
all to be safe and healthy and happy and comfortable and loved.
Yeah.
Um, and that I think that there's so many stories of Jesus trying to impart that on people, that idea. Like, we really do not have to kill each other. We, like, really do not have to scapegoat each other. We really do not have to do XYZ. Like, there's actually a much, much more creative and exciting way to be. Um, I think that, yeah, those stories for me really, like, solidify how interesting and creative love is,
Mhm.
Like, it's not just mushy gushy feel good stuff. It's like that's where the stuff is in
Yeah.
life, is like in love. I mean, it's easy to kill someone, really. I mean,
Yeah.
but it's really hard to love someone in,
Yeah.
like, in a way that, like, you can get through all the muck of difference. Um, so I think that's one thing, like the social gospel, the equity, the the profound teachings on love and relationship. Um, I also love, the like a theology of incarnation, right? That the divine came
Yeah.
to be with people through the person of Jesus, and that, I mean, not everyone believes this, but, like, by
Yeah.
extension, the divine chooses to incarnate through all of us and to
Yeah.
have this experience of life, I think is really powerful. Um, and that lends to, eh eh like, an ethic of the worth and dignity of all people, and the divine nature of all people, I think is a really, really powerful Christian, and you see it in many other religions, belief. I wish more Christians embodied that
Yeah.
belief, the worth and dignity of all people. Um, so yeah, I think those are, like, the really kind of powerful elements of faith for me that just, like, keep me coming back, um and I think, I really wrestle. It's funny, I really wrestle with, nonviolence. Like, I really want to believe in nonviolence and, like,
Yeah.
pacifism, and there's a part of me that really struggles with it sometimes. I don't maybe I have Mars in Capricorn. I have Libra rising and Mars in Capricorn, right? So,
Yeah.
like, "Ooh," but also like, "Oh." Um, and I think that there's, like, my faith troubles troubles violence for me in a way that I think that I just like really keep coming back to over and over again, right? Is like the like violence there. We can have like radical violence, but it's not
Mhm.
as radical as peace. It's not as radical as nonviolence, not as radical as love. Like that's not radical enough, right? Like violence is not radical enough. And um so yeah, I think that's something that I'm like always turning over in my hand like a
Yeah.
coin. Yeah.
What I've read about your having read a couple of your essays, what I really like is that you do seem to be like wrestling with these things and like like really thinking about these stories from all angles. And it's just interesting to think about the revival of like the Hellenistic astrology, right? It's all about people going back and translating and arguing, right? Like, what does this mean? And it feels like in the same way you're sort of doing that with these stories of like digging in and asking yourselves and maybe hope I mean, definitely it feels like more people should be doing that, maybe approaching some of the biblical works with the same rigor that we do with the astrological works.
There's a group of theological nerds that can hold a candle to the astrological nerds, and they're all arguing on Twitter. Um, but I think I
Are those
don't
your
blame.
people? Is that part of
What's that?
is I said, is that, are those your people, or is that a conversation you think is exciting? Is it happening, or is it happening in some ways that feel a little because they're
Yeah,
conversations.
I mean, I've never been much of a I've never thought of myself as a philosopher and like
Okay.
a in and I'm not super interested in philosophical debates, to be honest. Um, I mean, and that was like doing art and ritual in seminary was a choice. Like that was practical theology, right? Like this
Yeah,
is like
okay.
how do we take our beliefs and apply them in material, tangible life? Um, and so, no, I'm not like super interested in theological or astrological debates, to be honest. I typically do not wade into them unless they like get like homophobic or something like that. Then I'm
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
hey, like if they threaten my sense of justice, then I will show up to the fight. But otherwise, I don't have a dog in it. Um, but I was gonna say like I can't in some ways really blame people for not interrogating their faith because the church systemically,
Yeah,
um, I think diminishes people's sense of inner permission to even question anything, right? And so the fact that you can even question, that you can even interrogate, that you can even like look back at the history and that there's a church history, right? Where there are some turning points that are very problematic, right?
yeah.
Very patriarchal, very misogynist, very like colonist. And people just they don't know. And then once you realize like, oh, it's all made up. Like I can I can question who taught me this and how do they benefit from it, right? Then I
Mhm.
think that's like the really fun part of theology when it's like, oh, like, I can decide for myself and I can go back and look myself. So that's part of what I want to help people to do too, is feel like they can do that and God's not going to smite them.
Yeah. Uh, no, we're closing in on time, and I wanna be respectful, but the biggest question maybe I wanna get to before we end here is what has this why astrology? That's
Hmm.
the question. Why astrology?
Mm. I had some very lonely moments as a child, and the night sky quickly became my best friend in those
Yeah.
moments. And again, the 90s, not much to do, right? So there was a lot of look staring out the window at stuff.
I mean, my goodness, we had, like, light brights and, like, video games. I don't know.
So it was like, go look out the window at the star, like play the same CD you had again. Like
Like, gramophone. Here we are, like
it was a much simpler time. It like really cracks me up when I think about our childhoods and like just like how like there was not a lot to do, but there was. You came up with stuff, and I know it's so funny. But I just always love the night sky. I would comb the newspapers for meteor shower
Yeah.
announcements and set my alarm and go outside in the middle of the night, like on school nights, and like watch the meteor showers. So it was always there. I like
Yeah.
always loved it. Was always mystified and totally enthralled.
May I
And
ask where you grew up, by the way? Where were these night skies?
Delaware,
Okay, okay.
yeah, Delaware, and not many people grow up there and live in other places. It's one of those states, but, yeah, I think, like, I've just always been enamored, and I moved to a place where I could see the night sky better. I, like, very narrowly almost became an astronomer. That's, like, in college, that was, like, a sort of, moment, but, yeah, it's always there. I just think it's like it's one of the most evident maps that the divine gives us, one of the most evident linguistic systems that we have to, like, commune with
Yeah.
the divine, right? Like, whatever you envision the divine being. Um, and it is all over the Bible. It's all over the Bible. So it, like, really makes a lot of sense to me anyway.
Yeah.
I'm like, "Oh, this is" I'm just, like, kinda interested in mysticism in a way, and astrology is I mean, it's one of the oldest forms of mysticism there is. Um, and so, yeah, it makes total sense to me. Like, it has never felt incongruent at all.
The follow-up to that is when we're talking about consultations, what, what's, what tools does astrology offer you when sitting in consultation with someone, right? That bad pastor without astrology doesn't have, right? Like, what are the tools of
Mm.
astrology that you find most enriching to help people?
Mm. That's such a great question. I think, I mean, a really, really great framework for meaning making,
Mhm.
um, cycle reverence, like
Yeah.
like helping people respect where they are in whatever cycle they're in
Yeah.
and find meaning in that place, right? And like have it make sense to them and know when to expect it to pass, right? So it also gives some relief, right? Like you're feeling this way now, but by this time next year, probably not,
Yeah.
right? Once the node moves off your ascendant, like you're gonna be have a lot more energy or whatever. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
With that, are there any questions I didn't ask? I know I have 1,000 questions I didn't ask. If there's anything you wanna share that we didn't get to.
You asked so many good questions. I feel yeah, it's nice to talk and to even I think like astrologers and people who are in caring professions, helping professions, like don't often get a chance to reflect on their own stories. Like it's a lot
Yeah.
of reflecting on other stories. So I just really appreciate your thoughtfulness and your questions and being able to kind of like tie this thread together in a new way in 2024. And Yeah, I mean, the only thing I think I would want people to
Yeah.
know is that, like, uh, the clients that I work with are often not Christian. Like, I have
Yeah.
clients who are Jews, I have clients who are atheists, and it's my faith is not something that I ever wanna impose on people, right? It's, like, there if that's a
Mhm.
framework that people wanna engage with me,
Yeah.
but also if you just wanna talk about astrology, if you just wanna talk about meaning, if you wanna talk about your lousy husband, like, I'm here for it, right? It does not have to be, like, it within a Christian framework, so I think that's important, like, I feel very thoroughly pluralist, like, there
Yeah.
are lots of different ways to engage the divine, not just, like, one best way.
Well, uh, this has absolutely been my pleasure. I hope that you will talk with me again, because
I'd
now I'm
love
like, "Ooh, I
to.
wanna do a whole subject with you." With that, what are you up to? Yeah, what do you have going on?
Yeah. So I am always offering new programming that matches up with the liturgical cycle of the
Okay.
church. So right now I'm doing Lenten programming, and next I'll probably do some like Easter programming and
Mhm.
Pentecost programming, where
Yeah.
so I love to kind of get one foot in each territory, and like the church territory, and then
Yeah.
also the zodiacal territory. And the other big project that I'm working on is I'm on a team of people who is organizing astrologers to start a co-op. And we are launching a preliminary project for the next year on the decans, where we're going to have 36 astrologers write 36 pieces on the 36 decans that'll be released every 10 days. And so this is hopefully so that people can get really diverse perspectives on astrology. And so astrologers can grow their audiences. And then eventually, hopefully, we can have a kind of more like institutional grounding for some equity and some protection, and some like space for creativity for astrologers. So that's sort of like a really big thing that's happening right now.
Okay, I'm obsessed with you and that. Are there openings? Like, how can I talk with you about this after?
Yes, yes, you can. We've closed applications for the Deccan pieces,
Yeah.
but there's gonna be more, and we're hoping to launch the co-op next year, like officially, but we just wanna build an audience that will be ready to receive it when we're ready to launch it.
Oh my God, this is amazing. I'm so stoked for your work. And I'm just a little
Yeah.
jealous because I know there's a whole group of amazing Santa Fe based astrologers.
It's true. I am
Down that
loving the
pipeline.
relationships that I have here with Sam Reynolds, with Jonah Emerson Bell, with Michael
Yeah.
Bartlett. I mean, it's a really amazing group of people, and there are astrologers here that I haven't even met yet. So, yeah, it's
Can we do a field trip? Because I feel like I found a really amazing community of LA astrologers. We're not that far. I'm thinking we could have field trips. We
oh,
can go
I
back and
love
forth.
that. I love that exchanges.
Yeah, we'll send some over.
You come live in my house, I'll come live in yours.
I love it. No, but seriously, I was like, we should do some like cute little, maybe like weekends. And I feel like this feels doable.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I think, the American Southwest and West are pretty rad places with pretty rad people.
Yeah. Oh my God. Michelle says this has been a beautiful conversation. Thank you. This has been a
Oh,
beautiful conversation. I'm like this. I'm
thank
so happy we
you.
did this on the big screen. This is amazing. And so
Yeah,
people
like the
can
stars we are.
yes, love it. Bad is it just badpastor.com? I put it in the show notes, but your website.
.me. Someone
Dot me.
has purchased the .com URL, and if you're out there, I want it. You're probably not gonna sell it to me, but if you want to, please, please reach out.
Badpastor.me. You have Instagram. Your is it bad? Okay. Tell me before I miss you.
Bad.pastor on Instagram,
Okay.
bad_pastor_ on Twitter.
Okay.
And yeah, that's it. That's as far as I go on social media.
Wonderful. So book a consultation, follow you. Um, is it just sign up for your news? Like, what's the best way for can people sign up for your newsletter? Is that the best way for people?
Yes. In my link in bio, there's a
Okay.
like sign up for my newsletter thing. So if you find me on Instagram or Twitter and hit that link tree link, yeah, you can sign up. And that is the best way you will hear from me. So
Fantastic. And I'm going to do my little outro. I'm Vivi Henriette of the Zodiac, and I implore everyone to support me, sign up, follow me on Substack. That's the best way because that's way I release all of these videos and links to future talks. You can pay me if you like. I won't turn your money down. It would be great, but you can also just sign up for free. And I have 2 interviews I'm about to release in the next 2 weeks. One like tomorrow, and then one next week. I'm releasing an interview with Kyle, one of the co-founders of Psychedelics Today, which I'm stoked about. And the next one I'm really excited about is I'm doing an interview. I interviewed already, but to release it with do you know Bet Williams? She's a Santa Fe based writer.
the name is very familiar.
She just opened a performance space, and the name's not coming to me, but I feel like I'm obsessed with her. She's brilliant.
Cool.
So
Cool.
I'm excited I'm so excited for everyone to share that interview, but I'm gonna, like, shove that interview particularly in your face and encourage you to, like, make friends because I'm here.
Sounds good.
This has been so amazing, and I hope everyone who's watching has had a beautiful time. This has been such a treat for me.
I hope everyone after this goes and digs their light bright out of the attic and makes like an astrology glyph in it or something fun like that.
Yeah. Hi, Oscar. I also have an interview with Oscar, by the way. I owe Oscar questions. I'm obsessed with Oscar too, by the way. Who's Oscar? Did you read
Yay.
Oscar? Sorry, I'm taking the time to know, and I've been meaning to actually reach out to them and tell them how much I loved it. Did you read the article in the Mountain Astrologer?
I saw it. I haven't read it yet.
It's amazing, and
The
it,
interview with Dr. Alomi?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like I'm obsessed with it. And I can't
Mm.
remember the whole title right now, so I don't want to butcher it because I butcher things. But yeah, Oscar's interview with Dr. Alomi and the Mountain Astrologer is like it's worth the subscription.
I will say that every time I go to the co-op, because that's where they sell the Mountain Astrologer, I always move the whole stack of Mountain Astrologers to the front of the magazine rack.
I love it. I love it. Oh man. Okay. I will officially release you. Thank you for joining,
Thank you so
Oscar.
much
Thank
for
you,
this.
Michelle. Thank you, Lindsay, of course. This has been
Yeah.
phenomenal.
Oh, it's such a pleasure, and yeah, you're a wonderful interviewer, so thank you so much for the thoughtful questions and yeah, really appreciate it.
Lovely. Goodbye.